Hello, thank you for your patience. We're going to go ahead and get started. And first up is Robbie Siddle.
Hoping to share with you guys kind of a recap of the PEGI activities to date and some feedback from the final forum, the national forum that we held in December in DC. And I'm pleased to see that some of the people on the call were at that meeting. So welcome back for another conversation about the PEGI Project. I'm going to just kind of offer a review and then pass it off to my PEGI colleagues to share more information. Sorry, I think I'm kind of quiet, but I'm hoping that you can hear me better.
You're fine.
Okay. So next slide, please. Many of you who have sat in our meetings before have read the PEGI mission statement. We developed this early on as part of our guiding principles for the project. It has evolved somewhat throughout the project and probably will continue to evolve, but we are mostly focused on addressing concerns around preserving electronic government information. And we've typically focused at the federal level, although we have tried very hard to engage individuals, although we could probably do better, to talk about both state, local, and tribal government information as well. Next slide. These are our partner institutions. I think Martin will talk about our timeline later in the presentation, but these are the institutions that are currently represented in our IMLS grant project and will hopefully move forward as we look at next steps for the project, as yet to be decided. Next slide. We have some goals that we've set for ourselves that we've attempted to address throughout this year of the project specifically. So we have attempted to engage a variety of stakeholders in meaningful discussions. We've done this at many forums at conferences around the country. We went to the American Historical Association conference. We tried to attend as many diverse areas outside of our realm of librarianship as we possibly could. Again, with limited time and scope, we did what we could, but we also recognized we could do better. We have also tried to assess the landscape of creation, dissemination, and preservation of electronic government information. In addition to the IMLS funded project, we did partner with Educopia to contract an environmental scan. Many of you have seen this scan. If you haven't, it is linked on the Educopia website, so I encourage you to give that a read as well. We are trying also to align with other stakeholders who are working in these areas. So we've had conversations with the data rescue folks, other groups. So if you know of activities in these areas that we have not connected with, please help us figure out who we can talk to, and we would love to talk to people who are working in this area as well. And then we did explore a little bit the opportunity of using collective impact as a model for our efforts or future efforts. And we'll talk a little bit more about how we approach that and some of the outcome and findings that we've discovered around the use of the collective impact model. Next slide. I feel like I need a bing. So just because not everybody is familiar with the collective impact model, we wanted to include a slide that may hopefully help to introduce some of you to it. It is now I'm going to lose the organization that started. It came out of Stanford, and the general idea is that a group of organizations that may not be exactly the same, but yes, there you go, Stanford Social Innovation Review. Thank you, Scott. That may not have the same approach to doing things, but definitely have a shared idea of a need, come together and work to find solutions to a problem. And this has worked most successfully thus far that we know of in nonprofit sector dealing with community issues or social issues. But what it does do is it brings together a group of people who have a vision and work deliberately together to find a solution to a whole. So the people, these groups will come together with a common agenda. They have shared measurement to identify that their goals are being met. The activities of the groups are mutually reinforced. There is constant, continuous communication between the stakeholder groups working on the particular problem. And then there's a really strong backbone of support that makes sure the efforts are successful. So that is a very condensed, brief introduction to collective impact. If any of my PEGI colleagues have anything to add, I encourage them to do so. And with that, I'm going to pass it to Sherry Lester.
Thanks, Robbie. So I'm going to provide everyone with a brief overview of project activities that the PEGI Project has undertaken in 2017 and 2018, which then led up to our national forum, which was held in December 2018. Next slide, please. So as Robbie mentioned, our primary goal throughout the project year was to engage stakeholders in discussion so that we can identify alignment for future activities. We did so by having those of us who are project steering committee members attend different events and meetings in order to initiate and participate in conversations that we felt would lead us to a better understanding about various communities that are engaged with these issues, efforts that are currently underway, and interest in how to best direct efforts going forward. So we deliberately focused on engaging both within the library and archive communities, as well as beyond the community, those particular communities, into other stakeholders for government information, government records, government data, and long-term access to information, regardless of what that information may be. As part of our participation in these efforts, we built connections with people who are deeply engaged with these questions from perspectives sometimes similar to those of us who have been working on this project, sometimes coming from very different directions, backgrounds, and areas of expertise. We were deliberate in doing so that when it came time to develop our national forum, we had a very rich group of experts and invested stakeholders to draw on to make sure that we could really understand the questions and issues from a variety of perspectives. So next slide, please. In order to engage with these communities, we used a series of 3 questions to initiate conversations and elicit further discussions about the issues surrounding long-term access to foreign digital government information. And we learned a lot from these conversations because everyone took these questions in different ways and had different areas of focus and expertise and concerns and insight into actions forward. We did a couple of blog posts throughout the year that discussed some of what we learned in these questions. Our project white paper, which is not yet published because it's not all the way written yet, will also engage with some of the answers to these questions that we gathered throughout the year and a half that we were seeking this information. Next slide, please. Finally, as Robbie mentioned, we were able to meet at least one need that we heard of in the community, which is a broad interest in understanding the current landscape and ecosystem for government information, both the access and production side, as well as how it's described, managed, and made available for the long term. through the cooperation of participating institutions, including some funding, we were able to commission an environmental scan, which was researched and written by Sarah Lippincott. That environmental scan takes a look at this landscape and also identifies gaps and potential ways that collaborative efforts could bridge some of the gaps that we see. For more information, I encourage you to check out the environmental scan, which is available both from PEGIProject.org and also from our publisher, Educopia. So with that, I would like to turn this discussion over to Marie Concannon from the University of Missouri. Marie is going to give us an overview of the National Forum itself and what we learned there.
Okay, thank you, Sherry. PEGI's National Forum was the final culminating event and served as the capstone of the IMLS grant project. Its purpose was to build networks across institutions and essentially function as a springboard for PEGI's first post-grant collaborative initiative. With this in mind, we convened highly engaged professionals selected for their ability to represent their respective fields and industries well, and who exhibited potential to actively participate in the work that lies ahead. Among those in attendance were representatives from national and state archives, the U.S. Government Publishing Office, the Library of Congress, and executive agencies, as well as quasi-government organizations. From the academic community, there were librarians, digital preservationists, representatives of library consortia and academic groups, and professors who are deeply interested and engaged in this work. We were also pleased to have a number of community organizations present, some of which have pioneered new models to preserve digital government information and make it more accessible to the public. A complete list of participants is available on our National Forum report, which you can find through our PEGI Project website at PEGIProject.org. Designed by Dr. Catherine Skinner of the Educopia Institute, the facilitation plan for the two-day National Forum mapped out deliberate interactions that were carefully constructed to reflect the wide variety of perspectives and experiences of people in the room. Unstructured conversations often encounter sticking points and roadblocks, but Dr. Skinner's facilitation plan led attendees to explore the sticky issues together using a variety of exercises, including organized presentations, creative thinking activities, and facilitated table-based discussions. The first portion of the forum was devoted to defining the challenge. Table groups were asked to discuss what government information is at greatest risk for loss. Now, we had asked the same question at all the mini-forums throughout the previous year, but because people had more time to dive into the question at this event, we received richer and more nuanced responses. I can relay just a few highlights, and I encourage you to read the forum report on our website to learn more. When we asked what digital material is at risk for loss and what puts it at risk, we heard that, for one thing, metadata and documentation for datasets can be at risk apart from the body of material they describe, and this leads to loss of access. Federal information typically falls in the public domain, but the metadata may be proprietary. For another example, you may be familiar with some government websites that offer highly interactive elements, but dynamic content on these sites can be difficult to preserve in a form that retains the live characteristics. Another point our participants brought up is that different kinds of federal information can have very different kinds of risks. When one thinks of government information, one might call to mind work created by government employees. But there are also works produced by contractors at public expense, works created with the help of federal grant funding, and works created as derivatives of any of these. Each category, as you can imagine, carries its own unique constellation of risks to preservation and continued access. To learn more about risks to digital government information, see our forum report and Sherry Laster's blog entry titled Risk and Reward Mapping Gaps, which is on our PEGI Project website. Next, we asked, what are you confident is being preserved well? In other words, what does not worry you? Well, after the chuckles that followed that question, as if anything doesn't worry us, most agreed that information institutions having trustworthy digital Repository or TDR certification are at low risk. TRAC, T-R-A-C, is an industry acronym for Trustworthy Repositories Audit and Certification, and repositories must meet strict standards before they can be called trustworthy. We asked, how do you draw the line between what's at risk and what's being safely preserved? Now, this question helps set priorities. The reality is that it's not possible, or maybe even desirable, to preserve everything. This is indeed a difficult question to answer, and even experts may draw the line in different places. With such a diversity of experience and workplace background among our National Forum participants, it was particularly interesting to find out what they would recommend as goals for future collaborative action. One suggestion we heard was to adopt projects having a local focus. Although much of the discussion centered on federal information, it was acknowledged that information created by state and local governments is almost always at greater risk because fewer organizations seek to collect and curate it, and the institutions mandated to do so are often under-resourced. Advocacy was a key theme at this forum. Participants noted that more effective public support is needed for government programs that make information and data available. Many of these programs have been getting cut, and the Census Bureau's Statistical Abstract of the United States is one such example. The next set of activities were dedicated to looking at the terms we use when discussing this work. Achieving a common vocabulary is a key part of the collective impact model that PEGI has adopted. Earlier in this presentation, I mentioned the term trustworthy repositories, and that's a good example. The word trustworthy can mean one thing to a person on the street, but quite a different thing to a digital preservationist. Excuse me for a moment. Some terms may even have a meaning that's defined in the statutes. Our participants identified hundreds of ambiguous terms, only a few of which we have time to mention here. Terms like metadata, government, information, preservation, access, and many more. The image of the flip chart page on this slide is not a summary of the full conversation. It is just one of probably a dozen such pages that were generated during this exercise. All the trouble terms, plus some explanation for areas of confusion, can be found in the National Forum report. There's another aspect of the collective impact model that's also crucial to the success of any shared project, and that is having a way to demonstrate progress towards goals through shared metrics. So we asked our participants, what metrics would best demonstrate progress in preserving electronic government information? Some suggested a count of the number of web pages that get preserved, or files saved, or reports collected, or emails archived, etc. But should a report of 1,000 pages be equal to a one-pager? Some wanted to look for a smaller unit to count, such as the number of bytes. But even then, how can we know how close we are to achieving 100% success in saving all important electronic government information? The fact remains that nobody really knows how much of it exists and where it all might be found. Discussion naturally turned to counting the use of electronic government information. After all, it is fairly easy to count hits to a digital library or website. But there are pitfalls to this approach, too. The importance of government data is not necessarily indicated by the number of downloads. A prominent news story could increase the hit rate on a certain government report, while more important reports do not get such exposure. Measuring progress through systems and infrastructure. Storehouses for digital material are not created equal. Institutions that have trustworthy digital repository or TDR certification, or which follow another public auditing process, should probably be counted differently than those which do not have these. Also, if one takes a quantitative approach towards systems and infrastructure, then it may be useful to look at registries of official mirrors, both within and outside of institutions. Another possibility is to track the number of agencies that partner with data.gov for registering descriptive metadata for their data products, and the number of non-governmental organizations that partner with agencies on preservation activities. After considering many quantitative metrics and noting the limitations in each, some participants expressed a wish to include qualitative indicators. A compelling success story has the power to convince and persuade, and there's certainly a place for impactful stories to supplement quantitative metrics. It was generally agreed that news stories and ongoing press coverage describing the risks to long-term access to government data can do much to foster public demand. And getting the message across to legislators is an important part in keeping government information publicly available. It became clear to us that finding shared metrics can be challenging because preservation activities have complex contexts and many dimensions for determining what constitutes progress. However, nearly everyone agreed that there are enormous opportunities in improving public policy with regard to the preservation of born digital government information. You might notice in the image of the flip chart page at right that quite a few of the participants voted with their dots for improved policy, better enforcement of existing policy, and more funding for preservation activities. For the final portion of the forum, each table group was given time to design projects that would address preservation issues raised in earlier discussions. The instructions were to come up with a project title and description, potential partners, and possible activities, keeping in mind that it would be necessary to measure progress towards goals. The purpose of the Pathways Forward activity was not necessarily to create actionable blueprints, but rather to demonstrate the many opportunities for creative action that are available to us at this juncture. We had Friends of Federal Facts, or FFF for short, would provide leadership and administration for topic-based federal information advocacy groups. For example, there could be a Friends of Federal Facts for the Census Bureau, or Friends of Federal Facts on Climate Change. FFF groups would advocate for agencies to continue important data collection and information publishing activities. They would represent users such as scholars, journalists, and scientists, and really anyone in voicing the need for data in usable forms. They could provide ongoing feedback to agencies about the usability of their information products. The Development Network for Data Rescue Toolkit would seek to build a network of users both inside and outside of the federal government to collaborate on a data nomination tool for preservation purposes. The Domain eHealth Assessment of Government Presentation project would involve piloting the development of a framework for documenting government information that's being produced within defined subject areas. And it would do that in terms of how well this information is being preserved and the risks involved in preserving information in those particular subject areas. The framework would develop and employ a reusable methodology that could be applied to climate, health policy, biomed research, energy, transportation, criminal justice, immigration, international relations, child welfare, or any other areas. And then finally, the project to increase transparency of federal records decision-making would seek to develop a platform that makes records retention schedules more comprehensible, with a goal to improve public input into national preservation decisions. It would work closely with government archives to move from the current system, which can be confusing, to a system that is more open and easier for the general public to understand. Now, these were just 4 of the potential pathways forward suggested in our meeting, selected randomly. There were at least 4 others that were equally as compelling, but we just wanted to give you a feel for what these potential pathways forward were like. We hope that by sharing these ideas, we'll inspire you to design projects. Remember, this doesn't have to be a solo adventure. With the collective impact model, you'd have partners. Now, before the event concluded, we asked participants to vote with their stickers one last time on a commitment continuum. It was gratifying to see the majority of stickers cluster around the committed category. It surely indicates that we have sufficient energy to move forward with this work. And now I will pass the mic to Dr. Martin Halbert, Dean of Libraries at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro, who will speak to you about PEGI's Next Steps 2020 and beyond.
Hi, folks. Can you hear me okay? A little bit loud. Okay, I'll back away from the mic a little bit. Folks, we are very interested in hearing from you, so we wanted to reserve a chunk of this call for time to get feedback from you on our next steps. Go ahead and go to the next slide. This is just a recap of the PEGI initiative overall timeline. We have been working from a series of forums that we first started in the 2016 period, in which we started surfacing issues and getting feedback from people, undertook to submit the IMLS proposal that was funded and led to the forums that we discussed in this call in 2017, conducted those forums in 2018, the calendar year, culminating in the National Forum in Washington, D.C. that you've just heard about. This year, 2019, we are producing the reports that we had promised as part of this project. First, the National Forum summary, which I just provided you the link to in the chat window, which has been published on the Educopia site. And we'll be working on the final project report and an associated white paper as well. And in the course of that work, we want to explore the next steps and engage the larger community in this process of brainstorming. So part of this call is a first stab at trying to identify ideas for next steps. Where do we go from here? Go ahead and go to the next slide. So what we would like to engage you with is a discussion about these next steps. And we'll ask three specific questions. What pathways forward do you see for the PEGI project? How can the PEGI project continue to move these conversations forward? And in what ways do you hope PEGI can support your efforts in the near future? And how, as part of that, how would you want to partner with us? Our National Forum report that, again, you've got the link in the chat, you can refer to for the details on the different Pathways Forward projects that we brainstormed during the National Forum, if you'd like to reference them, both the four that Marie reviewed as well as the other ones that were developed in the course of the National Forum. And also, if you just have any questions for us in general, we'd love to hear from you. So what we'll do now is in the interface, there is a little symbol by your name where you can raise your hand. And when people raise their hands to ask a question, I'll have Deborah call on you one at a time, and we'll hear from you in this discussion. So if you have a question, go ahead and hit the interface to raise your hand. And if anybody's having a problem with that, I know some people are on a dial-in line. Maybe there's a chat window, but you probably won't have access to that. But if you are on a computer interface, you can raise your hand in the WebEx interface.
Martin, while we're waiting for questions to come in, I just want to make two notes which have come in through the chat window. First, make Phillips note that since the PEGI National Forum, the National Archives has actually improved its process for posting proposed record schedules and gathering public comments, which is fantastic news and something that I know that they're seeking additional feedback and participation going forward. And Cindy Etkin also noted that the Government Publishing Office has achieved its Trustworthy Digital Repository certification through ISO 16363.
Those are fantastic developments. Thank you for sharing. While we're waiting, if people have questions, we are particularly interested in thinking about some of the Pathways Forward projects to undertake potentially as grant-funded projects, and have thought about both another IMLS application as well as perhaps applications to the NEH or NSF. And if you are having any difficulty with the WebEx interface, if you want to chat a question just in the chat interface, that's fine as well.
I noticed that Patrice McDermott left a comment in the chat. If someone else could take over that, because I think mine and Dr. Howard's audio is having a feedback loop.
I'll go ahead and mute myself.
Okay, so I'll pick up coming from the chat. This is Shari again. Meg also notes that there will be a public webinar about the process, the new record schedule process, and a shift to newregulations.gov. And she's given a date on that of May 30th. So as soon as there's more details, we'll be sure to help get the word out and participate as well. And Patrice McDermott notes that she is on a panel with the National Archives at the Society of American Archivists meeting in August. And she's interested in discussions for those who have thought to share about making record scheduling and appraisal transparent and accountable. So, and there's more information and a link to the event in the scheduler for SAA.
Well, seeing as we don't have a huge groundswell of questions, I would be interested in knowing how many people on the call actually were at the PEGI National Forum. If you were, go ahead and raise your hand. And that tells me people are not able to figure out how to raise their hand in this interface, because I'm not seeing many.
Martin, from what I can see, we have maybe 10 or so on the call that were part of the National Forum.
Yeah, agreed.
And then Michael Halpern has asked about other ways to provide feedback after this webinar. And just to address Michael's question, we have had conversations within PEGI about maybe posting some forms that people can submit. So we haven't really made a decision yet, but yes, Sherry has mentioned our email address as well as Twitter, that we would welcome any feedback directly through either of those channels as well.
Okay. Jamie Patrick Burns has a question.
Go ahead, James. Jamie Patrick Burns. Oh, you meant to ask a question. Go ahead.
Oh, can you read Sherry's comment?
Sherry's bringing up that you can also reach out to the individual members of the steering committee, since we're all interested in continuing these conversations. One kind of project that we have been thinking about is in the NSF arena is a research coordination network proposal. For those of you that are familiar with that, it's a mechanism that is typical within NSF to bring together institutions on sharing like-minded research information. And given the number of institutions that are preserving information from federal websites, this seemed to us like a possible avenue, in addition to some of the pathways forward that we discussed at the National Forum. So there is a question from Sarah Erickson about will we consider continuing to hold another round of outreach forums as a pathway in its own right. This would certainly be possible. We have thought about, I mean, that's a very basic mechanism, and we should say that we will be presenting at the American Library Association national meeting in Washington, D.C. in June. Deborah or Sherry, if you have that information ready to hand about the date and venue for that presentation at one of the Godort sessions, if you could share it. But we are quite interested in that notion of continuing to host forums. The question would be, what would the aim be for a second round of forums? Would it continue to be raising awareness of this issue, trying to mobilize efforts between different research communities, or some other purpose? Sarah or others, if we did continue to do additional forums, is there a preference that you might have for what kinds of forums we might do, either informational or actually, sort of targeted project-based? Okay.
This is Robbie. As far as additional forums, we did hear in the national forum that there were several constituencies that we had failed or inadequately reached out to. And so if there were a way to identify some of those groups just to continue to raise awareness, I could see us doing that.
That is an excellent point, Robbie. Can you, for reference, I'm trying to remember some of the groups that we identified that were not there.
Tribal government and local municipal government was definitely underrepresented. We had few scientists in the room. That was pointed out as well. And we did try to engage at AAAS, and I think we were too quick on the heels of that one to actually really promote our presence there. So I do believe that there are probably similar subject area constituent groups that we might not have even considered yet. So just a thought.
Excellent.
Sorry, I didn't mean to.
No, go ahead, Deborah.
Jamie Patrick Burns, we've been trying to get the audio on that going. Are you able to speak now, Jamie?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Okay, go ahead. I'm sorry that took a minute.
Great. Oh, that's okay. I was just curious, as you're figuring out the next steps forward, how much those will try and find, common ground among the different constituents involved, or how much there'll be maybe different tracks or something specific to, say, local government or federal government or academic library or something like that?
It's a very good question, Jamie. We spent a fair amount of time trying to think about that and ended up spending most of our efforts in the project on federal information. but actually, some of the feedback we got indicated that local, especially municipal information, might be a category of information that was most at risk. We had at least one of the Pathways Forward proposals dealt with municipal information as a case study in the New York area, trying to coordinate information among the different boroughs there. And that was one of the main things that we thought about as a sort of a practical way of going forward, is doing a case study project of how municipalities could preserve local information at risk. But do you have any suggestions for us to consider?
I'm not sure. I think I can kind of see the benefit of both, since I don't know. I mean, it seems like the whole point is to kind of have a coordinated effort. So I think that's really good to like focus on the common ground. But I realize there's such a wide variety of resources and situations that some amount of differentiation would be good.
And just so that you know, Jamie, the idea behind the collective impact model includes this idea of many of sort of tracks, the way you described it, people being able to do sort of their own thing or what's within their own capacity or their organization's capacity, but that there's a communication and coordination and sort of overarching agreement on goals, so that we're all sort of pulling in the same direction, but people can pull their own load as they like. So I think your point is well taken, and tracks is probably something that's contemplated in that model if we're able to do that.
We have, now that people have been thinking about it, there are several comments and questions popping up in the chat. Michael Halpern has made a really good point about and you're quite right, Michael, because of our orientation as mostly academic librarians, certainly that perspective and bias did come out in the project. And if we could get more perspective from community users, that would be very helpful. If you have, again, any ideas about how we might better engage with end users, we'd be very interested in that. David has asked that he said that he's interested in working with PEGI to reach out to professional associations who can be advocates for the work that NARA, GPO, and other federal agencies are doing, since they can't advocate for themselves. He's given some examples of scholarly groups there that are important customers of this work and might be engaged in the project.
And I'm going to just chime in here and circle back to one of the Pathways Forwards, the Friends of Federal Facts. And all of these ideas are things that I think were part of that Pathway project, that it would be a way for people to tell their stories of how they're using federal information, whether it's data or other types of information. And it is something that could be very grassroots driven with a little bit of organizational oversight. So I think of many of the Pathway projects presented, that one could have high impact and low cost.
As we have thought about, there's sort of several questions or comments around partnering with different groups. We have had regular interactions in the course of the PEGI initiative with both the data refuge effort and also now increasingly with the PEGI group that maintains geophysical data. And we've wondered if there might be ways that we might partner with them to, again, continue to raise awareness and or do some practical things in collaboration with one another. Meg Phillips has shared a really good point about, this is a great group, Meg, the National Coalition for History, which she's bringing up, links many of the groups like this and is explicitly geared towards advocacy. And she's provided a link there. Thank you, Meg. Michael Halpern also has said that operationalizing some of these pathways ideas is a good method, and he's offered to provide more detailed input. Thank you, Michael. We would love to hear from you once you have a moment to reflect on what we talked about and share any ideas that you have. While we're wrapping up, we're coming up on the 10-minute mark to the hour. You are seeing on the screen now some different channels for contacting us, both our regular project website and the info@PEGIproject.org email that we monitor for inquiries from the field, and then our Twitter handle. So if you have, after you mull this over a little bit, email us and with any feedback that you have, and we'd love to hear from you. And I see Cindy has posed something in the chat about the trouble terms in the National Forum and a suggestion about coming to an agreement on the understanding of those terms. Yes, we spent a lot of time on the issue of vocabulary and how, you know, vocabulary is both powerful but also can get in the way of conversations because different groups understand common terms in different ways. Why don't we go, I see somebody, okay, Sarah, thank you, another comment. Yes, a question about urban and city planners who are big users and help members of the community find and use public data. The Chicago Metropolitan Agency for Planning had programming involved in using data. Chicago, you know, one of the things we found with the participation by some of the individuals from the New York City area is the larger metropolitan areas like New York and Chicago might very logically, just because they're so much bigger than most typical communities, be a great place to start because they generate a lot more information than other municipalities, and B, might have more organizational participants to get involved in either case studies or best practice efforts, best practice documentation efforts. So thank you for that contact on Chicago. And Aaron has given us the note about the Civic Switchboard Project. Yes, thank you, which has been developing. The Civic Switchboard is a great group for fostering partnerships between libraries and community partners around data preservation, and he's provided this link as well. Thank you. Well, if anybody has any last thoughts, please do send them to you, or any follow-on thoughts. Oh, and Margaret has given us something here. With regard to trouble terms, our experience at the Libraries Plus and Data Refuge was that trying to agree on a common definition was less important than making sure everybody understands the different definitions and which one is used in when and in what context. That's absolutely right, Margaret. I'll give it just one more minute, so anybody has any final thoughts? Absolutely. Thank you for reposting the link, Sherry. We will continue to post further updates on our website, and if you have additional follow-on thoughts, send them to the info@PEGIproject.org email address, and we would love to hear from you again. In coming months, as we lead up to the presentation at ALA, we will be starting work on our final set of project documentation, reports, and white paper, and trying to lay out some prioritized list of things that we think should be undertaken in coming months, whether by the PEGI initiative or in collaboration with other projects. I'd like to thank everybody who participated in this call, and special thanks to all the members of the PEGI team who worked on this presentation, Marie, Sherry, Deborah, who's driving everything, Robbie, and Scott, as always, for maintaining or monitoring the chat. Thank you, folks. Well, with that, I think we'll wrap up this call, and we'll check in again next time when we have future webinars. Thank you, folks.